There are stories the government buries not with lies, but with time, not with denials, but with the slow erosion of memory, until what was witnessed becomes folklore and what was real becomes impossible. The Fort Benning incident is one of those stories. For decades, it's lived only in the margins of classified documents and the trembling recollections of those who were there. But if you listen closely to the static between radio frequencies, to the unmarked reports buried in the archives of 1977, you begin to hear the echoes of something extraordinary, something terrifying. It began on September 13, 1977, deep in the pine thickets of western Georgia. Fort Benning was one of the most secure U.S. Army installations in the country. A fortress of training grounds, experimental exercises, and whispered projects that never reached the light of day. That night, roughly 1,200 soldiers were engaged in routine field operations. No active alerts, no foreign threats, just another humid southern evening under a dull amber sky. And then, everything stopped. At approximately 9:14 p.m., communications across multiple units began to fail. Radios went dead. Night vision scopes flickered white. Even the static, that endless hum of background frequency, fell silent. Witnesses later described it the same way. The world went mute. One soldier, Private First Class Alan McCarthy, would later testify under hypnosis that he remembered looking up and seeing something like liquid glass spreading across the stars. Another, Lieutenant Carmichael, reported an oscillating blue haze that distorted the treetops as though reality itself was bending. Then came the lights. No one could agree on how many. Some said 3, others 7. A few claimed there were hundreds, arranged in geometric patterns too perfect to be coincidence. The lights descended without sound, no rotor wash, no jet rumble, and hovered above the training fields, pulsing rhythmically like a slow heartbeat. The first reports filed that night described the colors as impossible to categorize. Not red, not blue, but something in between. Something the human eye could barely register. Several men claimed they felt the vibrations inside their skulls. For approximately 5 minutes, Fort Benning was locked in a state of total paralysis. Weapons malfunctioned, engines refused to start. Every piece of metal within 100 meters began to vibrate. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the lights vanished. Silence returned. The radios came back online. The soldiers stood frozen, unsure whether they had witnessed something celestial or something man-made. But it wasn't over. At 9:26 p.m., an alarm was triggered in Sector Delta 5, a restricted research area roughly 2 miles from the main barracks. No one knew exactly what Delta 5 contained, only that it was off-limits, even to ranking officers. The few who responded that night would never again speak publicly, but a civilian contractor, Dr. Raymond Haskins, an electrical engineer employed at the base, left behind a note in his journal, later confiscated by the Department of Defense. It read only, "The pattern is repeating. They are mirroring us." That same night, the U.S. Air Force reported unidentified. See, it would be really amazing if you could like this video and comment below. Aerial disturbances over Georgia, Alabama, and northern Florida, though all public flight records from the region were later scrubbed. And here's where the story fractures. The official report claims that the incident lasted 22 minutes. Yet, according to the wristwatches recovered from soldiers on site, nearly 2 hours had passed. Time itself had been altered. In the days that followed, Fort Benning entered total lockdown. Dozens of men were quietly reassigned, some discharged for medical instability. Others, like Lieutenant Carmichael, vanished entirely from the record. And though no formal explanation was ever released, local residents began to notice strange phenomena. Animals behaving erratically, electrical storms without clouds, a deep humming sound that seemed to come from underground. One farmer, whose property bordered the installation, reported finding an enormous circle of scorched earth, perfectly symmetrical, with soil fused into a glass-like surface. Military vehicles arrived within the hour. The area was fenced off, and the farmer was told, in no uncertain terms, never to speak of it again. What happened at Fort Benning that night was not an isolated event. It was a signal, part of a pattern stretching across decades, connecting secret experiments, mass sightings, and a project known only by its codename, Echo Mirage. In official history, Fort Benning's strange blackout is dismissed as a communications malfunction, but those who were there, those who still wake at night to the faint hum beneath their floors, know the truth runs deeper. Something came through that night, and it was never meant to leave. Officially, Project Echo Mirage never existed. No government ledger bears its name. No budget line item funds its shadow. Yet, if you trace the faint fingerprints it left in declassified memos, blacked-out reports, and the whispers of those who saw too much, a picture begins to emerge. And what it shows is far more terrifying than any UFO myth, because Echo Mirage wasn't about visitors from another world. It was about what happens when humans learn how to touch the machinery of reality itself. The origins of the project date back to the early 1970s, a time when Cold War paranoia infected every scientific field. The Soviets were rumored to be experimenting with psychotronic warfare, using sound, frequency, and electromagnetic resonance to manipulate the human brain. The Pentagon, desperate to stay ahead, launched its own secret initiatives. Buried beneath layers of defense contracts and academic partnerships, a new division took shape at Fort Benning, a collaboration between military engineers, neuroscientists, and theoretical physicists. Their goal: to weaponize consciousness. They believed that reality, the physical world itself, could be influenced by resonant frequencies tuned to the brain's electromagnetic field. Sound could move matter. Thought could bend energy. If controlled properly, they argued, it could bend space-time itself. And thus, Echo Mirage was born. Dr. Raymond Haskins, the civilian contractor whose cryptic note would later resurface, was among its founding members. His early notes describe experiments that sound like science fiction: acoustic mirrors, conscious harmonics, and reality phase drift. They were developing devices capable of transmitting not just sound, but states of mind. At first, the tests seemed benign. Soldiers were exposed to subsonic frequencies that induced calm, alertness, or disorientation. But soon, results began to defy explanation. One subject, after a prolonged session, began describing vivid imagery, geometric patterns, voices speaking in reverse, and landscapes that did not exist. He drew symbols identical to ancient Sumerian glyphs, despite never having studied them. Another subject vanished for 7 minutes during a controlled trial. Monitors showed no change. He was physically present, his vital signs stable, but his body temperature plummeted, and when he returned, he spoke a single word: reflected. That word would become the heart of Echo Mirage. The team began to suspect they were not simply inducing hallucinations. They were tapping into something larger, a mirrored layer of consciousness that coexisted with our own, a dimension where thought and matter were one. In a memo dated August 1977, 2 weeks before the Fort Benning blackout, Dr. Haskins wrote, "We have found the frequency. When all signals align, there is a bridge. The pattern is stable for 4.2 seconds before inversion begins. What we see on the other side, I don't think it's reflection anymore. I think it's observation." That same week, a new experimental device was delivered to Fort Benning, the Resonance Array Unit, a series of dish-like structures designed to amplify consciousness-generated frequencies. It was tested for the first time on September 13, 1977, the night the sky fell silent. According to reconstructed records, the array activated at 9:14 p.m. The same minute communications failed. The same moment the soldiers saw the liquid glass in the sky. Those lights, some researchers now believe, weren't craft at all. They were echoes, reflections of our own world, refracted back through a dimensional interface created by echo mirage. In other words, Fort Benning didn't experience a visitation. It experienced a mirror event. The experiment had opened a resonance field that briefly connected our reality to its inverse, a place where physical laws reversed and perception became tangible. The soldiers didn't just see the lights, they felt them, because they were seeing the vibration of their own consciousness, refracted through the mirror. The aftermath was catastrophic. 22 soldiers reported temporary blindness. 14 developed unexplained neurological symptoms. Seizures, loss of speech, altered perception of time. Several began hearing rhythmic tones that no one else could detect, a low hum that followed them for years. By dawn, Echo Mirage was shut down. All records were sealed. The resonance array unit was dismantled, its components distributed among different military contractors to prevent reconstruction. But Dr. Haskins disappeared before the investigation concluded. His home was found abandoned, papers burned, lab notes erased. The only clue left behind was a single cassette labeled Iteration 7. The tape contains a faint hum, a steady 9 Hz tone, and beneath it, a whisper repeating over and over again, "They're still listening." Officially, Echo Mirage never happened, but the soldiers who were there, the ones who still dream of mirrored skies, tell a different story, because when you tamper with the frequencies of consciousness, the question isn't whether something will answer, it's whether you'll recognize your own reflection when it does. In the years following the blackout, Fort Benning returned to its normal rhythm, drills, parades, and classified testing. But for those who were there that night, normal never truly returned. Their world had changed, even if no one could see it. The official explanation filed with the Department of Defense described the 1977 event as a temporary electromagnetic disruption caused by experimental radar calibration. A convenient lie, one polished enough to silence congressional inquiries and keep the media satisfied. But deep within restricted archives at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a very different story began to unfold. A classified task force, Unit 14B, later known internally as the Mirror Division, was formed to study the Benning anomaly. Their mission, to determine what the soldiers had really seen that night, and to understand why their equipment recorded reflections of landscapes that didn't exist. When the footage from the resonance array unit was recovered, something was immediately wrong. Frame by frame, the recording showed the night sky shifting like mercury, fluid, metallic, impossibly luminous. But when slowed down, researchers found something else embedded in the light. Reflections, not of the Earth, of another Fort Benning. In the mirrored terrain, the base looked identical. Same towers, same barracks, even the same vehicles parked along the fence line. But there were distortions, subtle and disturbing, buildings bent at strange angles, shadows that moved against the light, and silhouettes of people standing perfectly still, watching. When technicians enhanced the footage, one of the still figures turned its head, and for 0.7 seconds, it looked directly into the camera. The face was that of Sergeant Paul Jensen, one of the test participants that night. Except Jensen was behind the camera when the footage was taken. That was the beginning of what the scientists began to call the mirror zone, a theoretical reflection of our own world, existing at a slightly different vibrational frequency, a reality out of phase. Dr. Miriam Caldwell, who took over the project after Haskins' disappearance, wrote in her first report, "What the soldiers saw was not an illusion. The array didn't open a doorway, it created resonance. Two frequencies overlapping until their patterns briefly synchronized. In that moment, reflection became existence. To understand it, the team began running low-intensity simulations using smaller resonance devices. They discovered that under specific conditions, the environment itself would begin to echo. Sound waves repeated twice. Electronic signals returned with inverted polarity. Even shadows delayed, lagging a fraction of a second behind their source. The world was mirroring itself, and they were standing in the interference pattern. But the deeper they probed, the stranger the anomalies became. Personnel began reporting identity drift, moments where they'd glimpse versions of themselves, performing actions they hadn't yet done. One technician swore she saw her own hand move before she decided to lift it. Another claimed he passed himself in the hallway. Then came the auditory phenomena, whispers synchronized with the 9 Hz frequency that haunted every recording. They didn't sound external, they resonated inside the skull. When isolated, the whispers formed fragments of language. Return, reflection, not yours. Dr. Caldwell theorized that these weren't voices, but frequency echoes in the mind's attempt to interpret data from its mirrored counterpart. Yet as the experiments continued, personnel began to break down psychologically. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, hallucinations. One night, a technician named Hayes destroyed part of the lab's equipment, screaming, "They're trying to switch us. They're replacing us." He was found days later, miles away in the woods, disoriented, dehydrated, and repeating the same phrase over and over, "It's brighter there." That phrase, "brighter there," would later appear in Caldwell's final journal entry before the project was terminated. She described a growing instability in the mirror field, flickering distortions spreading outward, no longer contained by the lab. Objects around the base began shifting imperceptibly. Reflections in glass no longer matched what stood before them. Caldwell's final recorded words, recovered from a corrupted reel, were faint but unmistakable. "It's not reflection anymore, it's intrusion." After that, the mirror division was quietly dissolved. Fort Benning's experimental sector was sealed and repurposed. Every surviving scientist was reassigned or retired under non-disclosure agreements. But the symptoms persisted. Former personnel reported seeing duplicate shadows in daylight, distorted faces in water, and rhythmic tones that returned at the edge of sleep. Today, the official story remains unchanged. A radar test gone wrong. But beneath Fort Benning, sealed behind concrete and classified orders, there's still a chamber that hums faintly at 9 Hz. Sometimes late at night, the base guards report a low vibration rising from the ground, like an enormous heart slowly beating. And those who stand there long enough say they can feel it, a subtle pull, as though the world is breathing in reverse. By early 1979, Dr. Miriam Caldwell had become both the mind and the burden behind what was left of the mirror division. Her peers described her as methodical, sleepless, and possessed by an almost sacred terror of her own discovery. The project had already been reduced to whispers and locked doors, but Caldwell refused to abandon it. She wrote in her private log, "If what we've found is true, then our reflections aren't copies. They're counterparts. And if we've made contact, that means they've seen us too." The final months of her work read like the unraveling of a scientist's mind, or perhaps the awakening of someone who realized she was being watched by her own reflection. In February of that year, Caldwell and a reduced team of 4 technicians initiated Test Sequence 19A, an unsanctioned replication of the original Benning field experiment. The intention wasn't to open the resonance, only to stabilize it, to measure whether the energy signature could be contained. For 37 seconds, they succeeded. The frequency held steady at 9.02 Hertz, and for the first time, the mirror distortion appeared under controlled observation. Witnesses later described the phenomenon as a thin sheet of light, not bright but dense like glass underwater. Through it, they saw movement, faint outlines of people, equipment, even a version of the lab itself on the other side. Then the readings changed. The reflection began to lag, freezing for several seconds before catching up. And then it didn't. The mirrored image remained still, while the real lab continued to move. One of the technicians, Porter, leaned forward to adjust the sensor array, and the version of him in the reflection didn't follow. It simply stood there, frozen, eyes locked on him. Seconds later, the lights blew out. When they returned, the mirrored image was gone, along with Dr. Caldwell. Security footage recovered later shows the instant before the surge. Caldwell moving toward the field, her voice cutting through the static. "It's not a barrier, it's a membrane." Then a burst of white, followed by total blackout. When the systems rebooted, her position was empty. Only the faint hum of the resonance field remained, oscillating just below the human threshold. The military sealed off the entire testing bay within hours. Each member of her team was debriefed separately, their testimonies scrubbed for inconsistencies. Official cause of death: accidental exposure to experimental electromagnetic field. But one of those technicians, the youngest, a man named Corbin Taine, leaked fragments of his interview years later before disappearing himself. In the leaked transcript, an investigator presses him. Interviewer: "You're saying she walked into it?" Taine: "No." It reached out to her interviewer. "Explain." Taine: "It wasn't light anymore. It was like the reflection wanted her, like it recognized her." Weeks after her disappearance, Caldwell's personal quarters were cleared out, but her journals, nearly 400 pages of them, were never entered into evidence. Only fragments surfaced in a classified addendum to Project Benning's closure file. One of those entries reads, "I hear them at night, not voices but patterns. It's as if my own thoughts are being echoed back at me, slightly delayed. I don't think the mirror is passive anymore." Another, dated 2 days before she vanished, simply says, "When I look in the glass, it smiles first." The last page of her notebook was found months later during a base renovation wedged behind a cabinet. It contained a set of coordinates, not to Fort Benning, but to a small, overgrown clearing 30 miles north near a decommissioned radar station. There, investigators found nothing except melted soil and traces of magnetized iron, the same residue recorded during the 1977 event. By 1980, the Mirror Division was quietly erased from the official record, funding reallocated, personnel scattered, but the locals around Benning still tell stories about a faint blue shimmer that sometimes appears in the trees at night, about soldiers who patrol the forest but never admit why. And sometimes when the air is still and the stars are hidden, you can hear it, a low rhythmic pulse beneath the wind. Those who've stood near it describe the same impossible sensation, their reflections faintly visible in the dark glass of their own eyes, moving just a second out of sync. By the spring of 1981, Fort Benning had gone quiet. The sealed research wing, once humming with electrical resonance, stood abandoned. Its corridors stripped, its walls painted over in military gray. On paper, Project Benning no longer existed, but deep beneath the base, one final experiment continued in secret, one that would end everything. The man overseeing it was Major Thomas Greer, a career officer assigned to oversee the data sanitization phase. His job was simple: erase what was left. But Greer was curious. He'd read Caldwell's notes, the missing pages, the encrypted files, the strange repetition of one phrase across her handwriting. It's not reflection anymore, it's migration. And so, on May 14, 1981, Greer disobeyed his orders. He powered on the resonance array one last time, connecting it to the facility's dormant frequency grid. The logs show that he calibrated it manually to 9.14 Hz, slightly above the recorded mirror threshold. He hit initiate at 3:12 a.m. 3 minutes later, the base lost contact with him. The only evidence of what happened next came from a recovered reel labeled Audio Log 41F. It was buried inside a classified file, later leaked during a data breach decades later. The recording is degraded, warped by static, but fragments remain clear enough to make out. 031322. Low vibration, metal objects rattling. Greer, resonance stable, field pattern consistent, subjectively brighter in the room. 031401. A hum, deeper now, almost organic. Greer, this isn't light, it's... Pause. Greer, my shadow, it's on the ceiling. 031443. Screeching feedback, then silence. 031506. A second voice, faint, filtered through distortion. Unknown. You're late. That was the last audible line. No one knows who or what spoke those words. When security entered the lab, the array was still running, but the control room was empty. Greer's uniform lay folded neatly beside the console, and on the glass panel, faintly burned into the reflection, was the imprint of a hand, reversed, as if pressed from the other side. After that night, Fort Benning's lower sector was permanently sealed. Concrete poured over the entrances, new facilities built above to mask its existence. The official closure memo cited radioactive contamination, though none was ever found. The recordings, data, and surviving personnel were transferred to a black-budget archive in Maryland under a new codename, Operation Looking Glass. But the transmissions didn't stop. In 1983, amateur radio operators across the eastern U.S. began reporting a repeating signal at exactly 9.14 Hz, hidden within shortwave static. Each transmission began with a burst of high-frequency noise, followed by 30 seconds of silence. Then a voice whispering a single word, "Return." The military denied it came from any known source, yet when triangulated, every signal pointed back to one place, the woods north of Fort Benning, the same coordinates found in Dr. Caldwell's notebook. Years later, a group of civilian researchers visited that site, hoping to debunk the legend. What they found remains one of the strangest documented anomalies in modern military folklore. They described the air as electrically charged, though their instruments detected no field. The compass needles spun in slow circles, never settling. And when they reviewed their video footage, they noticed something chilling. Every reflection, from the camera lens to the shimmer of water nearby, showed extra figures that weren't in the group. One of them, framed briefly in the reflection of a flashlight beam, was unmistakable, the outline of a woman in a lab coat. Her face was turned toward the lens, and she was smiling first. Today, Fort Benning remains operational, a modern base with no official record of any experiment from 1977 to 1981. But among the oldest staff, there's an unspoken rule. No mirrors in the lower maintenance tunnels. Those who've worked the night shift say that sometimes the air feels heavier there, a faint vibration that seems to sync with your heartbeat. And if you stand too long near the sealed elevator shaft, you might catch it in your peripheral vision. a ripple of silver light, like a reflection searching for its source. The brave ones look directly at it, the wise ones don't. Epilogue. Every 37 years, the same span between the 1977 blackout and the next solar minimum, the 9.14 Hz signal has been known to reappear, weak, distorted, always beginning with a pulse of sound that feels more alive than mechanical.